Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam.
Hello, hello.
And we are the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And this episode marks our 100th episode.
Woo!
Woo!
There we go. We
Nice.
got one sound effect. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So I went back and listened to our first recording recently, conditions for a specialty matcha preference acquisition. And thought it aged pretty well. So it's been quite the journey. So far, it has just been a fantastic excuse, both to document our own learning journey and kind of as a forcing function for us to make sure we
Mm,
have something interesting to talk about every week. Because if you're not
yeah,
accountable to, it
yeah,
slows you down.
exactly what I've been saying for, I guess, 100th times. We discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts.
It's just also been a fantastic excuse to interview people that have much more
Yes,
knowledge.
that's a really interesting. I would say kind of disarm a lot of people and let them share a lot of honest opinions.
Yeah. And it's allowed us to fill our own curiosity gaps. The more we learn, the more questions we have. And a lot of that knowledge is locked inside someone's head for some reason or another. And I think especially the gift of a podcast format is one that ideas are allowed to breathe a little easier. It's a little more conversational. Like it's less pressure to get something right. But
Mm,
also, people start to open up. A lot of people in the Japanese tea community and in the matcha community tend to be a little more reserved and less willing to be critical. But typically, after about 20 minutes in a podcast format, people really start to open up.
yeah,
Take some time, and everyone has sort of their own way of opening up, but it's interesting because, if it's buried in minute 40 in a podcast episode, the likelihood of someone taking it out of context is much less likely,
yeah.
than, writing an article and someone, being critical of Chano Yu or criticizing some part of the Japanese tea ecosystem. So this podcast format has been oddly, I don't want to call it successful, but effective at getting people to express more controversial opinions.
Yeah, like we're trying to really offer kind of like a safe space for people to share their honest opinion, and we kind of trying to do that for ourselves too.
Yeah, and it's
Um,
not so black and white. I mean,
yeah,
there's
yeah,
some positions that we take that we're not totally confident are gonna age well.
and frequently it's Ryan and I both take a slightly different position, and we're trying to either debate or argue or convince each other, but eventually we reach to a common ground, and I think that's pretty typical scenario how a lot of episodes unfold.
And that's the
and
beauty of long
that's
form.
yeah, it is.
I mean, it is hard capturing nuance in a 30-second reel. Like, I love short form content. I think the people who do it well are just incredibly talented. But like a lot of these concepts are like very nuanced and like need to be examined from multiple sides, which
Yeah.
also makes this podcast very hard to clip. But today, for the 100th episode, we wanted to look back and have a conversation between us about what we feel like we've gotten wrong, or what are areas that we think might not age well, or
How has our opinion?
change. So if you would have talked to me 10 years ago, before I was into matcha in the industry the way I am now, I was really into Chinese tea ceremony. I was an Emoto Senkei student. And I was really into the concept of tea as a product. If you would have talked to me 10 years ago, I would have told you that Japanese tea is incredibly industrial en masse if you compare it to other types of tea. That was a judgment that I had that I think I got wrong the deeper and deeper I go. I agree to this statement sort of still. You don't see the levels of artisanal craft and production the way you see in Taiwan for an oolong or in pu'er in mainland China and other types of tea where it's actually truly being hand processed. And in Japan, the vast majority of the tea is not hand picked. It's all using machine harvesters. It's actually pretty technologically advanced. A lot of the major farms are sending soil samples off to lab, amino acid measuring content in the leaves. But actually, I think it's the future of farming the deeper we go. I actually have grown to appreciate this very science first approach to Japanese tea. And it's one of my former opinions that doesn't age well.
Well, it's really a system that has evolved to adapt what Japan is,
Mm.
truly, right? The lack of labor force, the terrain that they need to overcome to do a consistent and sustainable farming for themselves. And I think that being so critical about it from a Chinese or Taiwanese point of view, I think eventually these countries are going to face this reality sometime in the future too,
Yeah, you
because the entire Asia is declining in population.
actually, very recently, I was listening to an old interview with Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore and their first prime minister. And he was talking about Japanese immigration situation. And if you talk to anyone who's tried to immigrate to Japan, it is just incredibly difficult to stay there. That country, like, basically tries to reject foreigners in every way it can. Less so for students, but it's very difficult to actually go and try to live in Japan. And he was saying demographics is destiny, basically. And that I think at the time of the recording, there were like two or three productive adults for every non productive old citizen. And it was projected, and I think this interview was done in like the 1970s, and it was projected by the year 2050, there'd be 1.2 productive working adults for every one person, which is really demographically imbalanced and is a sign of a dying country, literally. And that he was actually praising the United States for its immigration policy. I don't think we can do that anymore. But saying that having levels of immigration to support the country, and it makes sense within the context of a country like Singapore, which has embraced immigration to the extreme. It's actually a wonderful case study of a bunch of different ethnic groups living together in harmony among Chinese, Malays, and Indians primarily. So I think Japan's has to have this level of extreme automation, and
Yeah,
that's the future.
yeah.
And there's an interesting tension there because also that means the death of these artisanal crafts. If you watch any of Mark from Oika's content, a very typical framing is preventing the extinction, the endangerment of these very old crafts where there is indeed a lot of knowledge.
Or a quote to protect or preserve heritage.
So there's an interesting tension. You can criticize that it is becoming so industrial so fast. And economically speaking, from like a macroeconomic lens, it has to if it's not going to embrace immigration and if it's a dying country demographically speaking. But with that death is also a death in culture. So it's our opinions on the levels of industrialization, there's such a natural tension there that we've explored on the podcast. And I think sometimes we take one side, being lovers of a hand produced product, artisanally crafted tea, really old school knowledge to produce interesting things, and the preservation of genetic diversity like Zairai, and the use of Hanzu shading with rice straw instead of synthetic canopies. And
But
it's also not sustainable. You can't love one and be critical of the other at the same in the same breath if you really care about the system as a whole.
it's true, it's true. But also, like, it also comes down to, like, our discussion topic about authenticity, right? It's about the intention of doing something. If the intention of doing something is not trying to restart. Dying culture is a pretty interesting take. Dying culture is a pretty interesting observation, but if you view it from a um, kind of authenticity lens, but culture is dying because it doesn't necessarily have the soil to thrive and survive anymore. And in order to kind of force it to exist, you have to kind of put it into a museum, into a glass shelf. But it's really not sustainable because the environment has changed. And the new culture right now, the new status quo is a fully automated, very heavily industrialized tea production environment that we are seeing in Japan. This is the new culture. This is the new phenomenon that that's the only, I would say, maybe not only, but the very few sustainable way that the Japanese can still to produce tea right now and maybe in the future too. So
We find ourselves on both sides of these arguments, actually. It's and
it's very difficult because on one hand you can really advocate and demand like culture or tradition being preserved. On the other hand, we are not doing it. It's the farmer on the ground that's actually need to overcome all these difficulties. And you cannot just like tell them what to do. Like they have to survive. They are human beings too, and they have a business to run.
yep, and a
Mm.
legacy to carry on. It's
And
complicated.
it is complicated. And I think that, for someone to make the claim or advocation that have some gravity or weight into it is that they also participate, right? Like for example, like Mark from Oikao, or even like Nekohama, who's been going door to door to farmers in Japan to help them revive their way of doing agriculture. I think, but it's hard, right? It's very difficult seeing them doing all these kind of things and overcoming all these societal changes almost feels like they're, heading towards a inevitable failure, which is very it really
In what way do you mean inevitable failure?
well, there will be fewer and fewer farmers.
You mean as a whole a system as a whole?
As a system as a whole, right? Like
Farmers aging out,
they are working with farmers that are literally like not going to be with us for the next maybe a decade or few. And there will be no one taking over, or very unlikely. So it's there's a lot of respect to all these people, making their endeavor, but at the same time, um, being so critical about the current system, like the current like industrial system that people are doing in Japan, trying to produce more tea and trying to maintain business. I think there's a really fuzzy line out there, like how it's hard to be critical after learning so much context.
yeah. And going back to the but and also their policies don't make it very easy. We've talked to probably 4 or 5 very serious people who are non-Japanese that wanted to do
Yeah,
farming in Japan.
that too.
It's
Japanese
really hard.
don't want your help.
Apparently, even if you are Japanese, getting land and the right licenses, etc., it's very hard to do agriculture
Yeah.
if you are Japanese.
Um,
So it's this there's also these types of barriers, but the number of conversations we have, really serious people, like people who would put time and money and effort into reviving abandoned tea plantations or starting their own, they just can't do it. They face so much friction, and you hear about people on the internet complaining about this all the time. It's hard to open a bank account. It's hard to start a company there. Like it's just like very tricky to do this. And then even if you do want to, like, let's say, license a plot of land from another farmer, it's a very difficult work and business environment to do so. I mean, we would love to have a little contract plot someday, to do a bunch of experiments and really understand the agriculture a little bit more. But it would be almost impossible for us. It's such a daunting task. It's honestly not worth the effort of even trying. At least where we're at the moment. I mean, as soon as our mill becomes economically viable and starts generating some profit for us, it is something we would love to do. And the reality is, we're probably going to do it in China. We're actually certainly going to do it. We
we
actually
have done it
have
in
done
China.
it in China, because it's so much easier to navigate. And there's not all of these quote unquote stupid rules, um, which offer some level of protection. They help protect against over consolidation, of farming, and allow smaller farmers to thrive. There's some merits to some of these rules.
Yeah, but the
Um,
reality is there will be no farmers to protect in the future.
Yeah, more and more if you look at the overall demographic tables. So that's an interesting tension that we've explored over the course of 100 episodes. And I think you'll find some episodes where we're very pro small farmer, intergenerational, preserving the craft. And you're also going to find some episodes where we're very pro technology and the necessity for innovating higher yield, higher quality tea, science first approach, using automate means of automation.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, like, it really comes down to what do you care by the end of the day? Where do you care the most? Which ground do you stand?
Another thing that we aren't sure will age well or if our opinions will change is our take on Chanoyu, or Japanese tea ceremony. We have been relatively critical of both Omoto Senke and Urasenke and the whole system at large. Not that we have a bone to pick, but it's very rare to have people question assumptions. And I think it's over romanticized and over glorified. And it's not a popular opinion. And we've actually gotten some hate mail about it over the course of 100 episodes, basically saying, stop slandering tea ceremony. I don't think that they have the past to not be criticized. Were former practitioners. I studied Emoto Senke for 3 years. Sam studied it for, I think, about a year and a half. But we were in a really unique educational scenario where we first started getting serious about tea at Penn State University. And there was something called the Tea Institute at Penn State. And at the time, we were the only organization in the United States that hosted both Emoto Senke and Urasenke schools of Chana. So you had to pick a school for formal lessons, but anyone could attend the public events and the lectures. And, a couple times a semester, and we would both sit in on these lectures from both the Motosenke and Urasenke, and as well as their public demonstrations, which gave us a pretty unique perspective on how both schools kind of approached things, their
Mm.
similarities and their differences, which has given us a foundation to be critical, especially having also a Chinese tea background takes a very different approach to a lot of these things.
Yeah. I mean, this is the specialty matcha podcast. And based on our own curiosity and our background, what we care about the most naturally is tea, right? Tea
Yeah.
itself. And tea ceremony on its own, it's really a wonderful, I would say, vessel, a vehicle to carry a lot of these Japanese culture and element and make it relevant to the modern context and people in the modern days to relate back to a very old tradition. But it's really not a place for you to learn anything about tea, and it's also a place that's, I would say, dragging more people to appreciate just tea itself in the broader context. It's implementing a lot of these baggage and burden for you to, or for anyone to almost trying to inflict a sense of guilt to just enjoy tea or matcha on its own without any, other cultural education or context. It's almost difficult to treat matcha just as a beverage.
Yeah. And the other thing about it is just it's a very conservative traditional art form inside a country that is really not that advanced among first world nations in what we'll call liberal values. And I'm not talking about liberal versus conservative, like I mean like basic things like gender equality and general opportunity depending on, no matter what your class or background is, for example. I mean, among G7 nations, Japan ranks the worst. It is still, if you listen to Japanese scholars or economists, it is just like pathetic how poor they are on gender equality. I think 50% of enterprises in Japan don't have a single woman executive. And this is very well documented in other works. There's a book that deep dives into this called Japan and the Shackles of Its Past. I might have gotten the title. I might have missed one word there, but it's approximately this that talks about basically a revolt of women who basically just bow out of the system because it's not even worth trying to fight.
Yeah.
Very similar problem in Korea and Korean culture too.
It's more of a societal structural problem that Japanese tea ceremony just happens to be a pretty wonderful condensation or lens towards all of these aspects.
On the words of Dr. Rebecca Corbett that we had on, she was like, "Yeah, you know, Japan is a very conservative country in this way, and you probably wouldn't look to Shanayu as the fertile soil for a revolution or change across these aspects that are the more dark side of Japanese culture."
But over the course of time, as we kind of reflect on how a lot of these contemporary matcha cafes and matcha consumption is evolving. I think in a few episodes we talk about there's actually a lot of things that modern matcha cafe owners or brand owners can learn from Chanoyu. And we think that there are a lot of wisdoms in it that we can distill.
The problem is that people only have a surface level understanding of Chanayu, and that's what gets communicated
Yeah,
in most
yeah.
Chanayu education,
You only learn from the forms,
not the spirit.
not the
And
spirit.
the
And I think the
spirit
spirit is what's the most valuable.
and to learn the spirit, you really just have to take the lessons and suffer. And suffer, I mean like physical discomfort of sitting in Seiza. It's a very non-linear path. If you're used to Western style education of being able to ask questions and things being explained very explicitly and in plain terms, this is not where you go. It's very Eastern type of education, Zen learning through experiences. There's a whole philosophy actually behind this level of education that's fascinating to read about. But it is a slow process in which you are more of a passive observer than an active learner. And you really go through. I mean, the first thing that you learn, at least in my memory of studying Omoto Senke, is something called Wadi Geiko. And I had to beg students at Penn State, just like, please, just suffer through this. You're going to be folding wet napkins and dry napkins for a little while, but I promise it's worth it. You will eventually whisk matcha. The sweets are really good. Nothing is as rewarding as going through all of this to enjoy your 3 sips of tea and your wagashi.
But even from Body Gecko, I think there's a lot of things that you could learn from it.
Totally,
The
totally.
intentionality of the caring of items, of objects, of experience of the guests, like the setting up, the whole kind of vibe for someone to like pay attention to things that they take it as granted. Like there are a lot of these interesting like philosophy that's so baked into the tea ceremony that's I don't think never taught. You really have to experience and kind of discover these intentionality yourself along the way.
Yeah, all of these moves, and some are explicitly taught. Like for example, the host never turns their back to their
Mm,
guests,
mm,
with
mm,
one exception, and that's when you're removing the wastewater bowl.
mm.
When you're like essentially removing the trash from the room,
Yeah, you're
it's
using
it's
your body
okay.
to hiding the
Yeah,
trash,
like
basically.
very and then there's a bunch of other things, like, in some cases, you need to do moves where you go under the bowl, not over the bowl. And, like, in some cases, you can ask some questions. I mean, let's be real, and remember someone asking, "Why do you have to go under?" And, like, we were in our T-shirt. Well, it turns out that if you're in a kimono, has that gigantic flap coming off of your arm,
The sleeve.
you literally cannot go over the bowl. And so a
Mm,
lot of these semi-arbitrary rules are actually very well grounded in very
mm,
practical things.
mm.
But just the level of care and respect about preheating, even like little things like when you take water, scoop water out of the kama, when you're actually making the tea, you are supposed to leave water in the scoop as if you are giving an intentional, perfect amount of water that you're putting into the tea bowl to whisk your matcha, and then you return the rest of the hot water to the kettle. It's not like you're just dumping everything in. It's you want to purposely over scoop so that you can leave some in your scoop and return it to the kama to demonstrate to your guest the level of care and precision that you're putting into that particular bowl.
Mm, mm.
Like all of the, like there's all sorts of, and this spirit is wonderful and showing that level of care and intentionality. And there's just so many different examples. And like, they talk about it. Like I remember reading some material for the Kyoto Tourism Board and the way that tea ceremony is incorporated into the sort of the tourism centers, educational centers in Kyoto. And they said, like, no one actually wants to learn tea ceremony. There's a rigid hierarchy. It's very physically uncomfortable to actually attend a real tea ceremony. In the 1800s, during the Meiji Restoration, they did invent a ceremony that can be done on a table. And so you do see some versions of that. But for what people think of as quote unquote authentic, something that would be in a TV show or in a movie on a tatame mat, right? It's a half-hour ordeal and to actually experience one would probably require, I don't know, 20 hours of education to actually play your part in learning the moves, learning the formality, learning the language, learning the etiquette. Like it's not something you can actually participate in until you've been educated. So
Mm.
they give everyone this watered down experience where you're learning to sit in Seiza, you're learning about the Chasen, Ichigo, Ichie. It's just the most super level stuff, superficial level stuff. It is not actually the spirit of the ceremony that can be learned elsewhere. Again, we are criticizing Chanayu and the way it's presented to the majority of the world.
And we're also criticizing a lot of modern follower or practitioner nowadays that only learn the form, not the spirit of the ceremony. Like using, dirty chas and whisking your matcha in front of the guests is really not a way to show authenticity. You better just use a frother.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most articulate people who talks about this in the community is David from Tizumi. Watching his YouTube content, I love it. And his whole philosophy behind this, I really recommend if no one's listened to his content. I don't think there's someone who is as articulate that's speaking in English, that's thinking about how tea ceremony can be applied to contemporary culture and that intersection of Chanayu spirit in contemporary culture. I'd love to have him back on the podcast to talk more about that.
And his tea ceremony school,
Yeah.
a very rebellious one.
Based in Hiroshima. I forget the name of the school. Our friend Paul, too, from Tea Nursery is also part of that school. Actually, it kind of makes me, every time I hear them talk about it, I'm like, oh,
Oh, I can.
would they accept a former Remoto Senke student? Like, it sounds much more liberal and progressive
Yeah, yeah.
than these more common large schools. Not to hate on any particular school. I think what Amoto Senke and Urasenke have done is incredible for, if you really zoom out, for protecting Chanoyu and promoting the idea of matcha. I don't know if we'd have this matcha boom if people weren't interested in Japanese culture and the carriers of Japanese culture, where in the 70s and 80s, you had all these rich businessmen travel abroad, and typically their wives would go with them. And part of the good wives and wise mothers policy meant that they were educated in Chanayu and they set up their own local branches. I think that's how a lot of foreign branches got formed. The foundations of their early Japanese practitioner base of Japanese expats living abroad, which then, piece by piece led to the matcha explosion that we have today. So I don't know, Zunjun, are we too critical on Japanese tea and tea ceremony? I mean, it
I
is
think
very sexist.
yeah, yeah. It's I think it's just like all the other situations that we are seeing in the tea world. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating in a way that we keep hitting all these walls that just cannot be overcome, and eventually we kind of accept it as a status quo. The silver lining of it is so shiny that you cannot disregard its benefit to the modern days and to also to what we care about.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's complicated, right?
No, it's complicated. And, the temptation to just blend all Japanese tea culture into one thing, one idea of authenticity, and looking at these histories is my criticism of a lot of these modern matcha companies is they kind of take this unified approach, this all inclusive, this grab bag approach to bucketing all of Japanese tea culture into one thing. And it always involves Eisai, it involves Senyorikyu, it involves all the tea ceremony schools, maybe like Hideyoshi, and then like modern day Uji matcha and its legacy, right? Like it's just presented as one unified narrative for tea and tea history and tea culture. And the reality is far more messy and complicated, especially when many parts of the culture are very imperfect. And, at its worst, I feel like Chanayu and the dominance of the Chanayu narrative authority is that it just plasters over some very ugly parts of the culture. Like if you listen to people who have studied Urasenke for decades, and there's some podcasts out there where you'll have a woman tea practitioner that's been studying it for 20 years that is treated less well than a man that's been studying for 2 years, and they get shoved to the front, and then all the women get shoved to the back. And there's all these implicit and explicit. But the part that bothers me is if you think about sexist and misogynistic and old world institutions, and if you think about it in terms of their survival rate, which are the first to get dismantled? It's the most egregious examples, if you look throughout history, the most blatant versions of sexism in our modern society will get stamped out first, and where you have a large enough group of people revolting, and then women have the right to vote, for example, more it's heavily explicit. You see the systematic dismantling of racist and sexist institutions. And then if you think of where the longest living versions of sexist institutions can survive are the most seemingly innocent places.
Hmm.
And Chanhayu and tea ceremony and all of these institutions there are the most innocent versions, the most implicit, the most subtle, the most delicate versions of sexism that are less clear. It's not obvious until you step foot into a Japanese tea ceremony that's being run by a very traditional practitioner and the way that they're ordering and arranging the guests. Or you hear about stories of Midori Kai, which is a residency program for Urasenke practitioners where foreigners come and study at the Kyoto headquarters for a year. You have to really dig deep to find these little pockets of what I'll call socially acceptable institutions where this sexism still lives.
That's a very interesting observation, Ryan. And frequently, I found all these institutions that have all these kind of baked in hierarchies are the institutions that are claiming to serve for a greater good. Religions, academia institutions, you frequently end up encountering these very old world legacy, racism or sexism. And these places, you really can see a similarity between them and tea ceremony schools. The way how the dogma got indoctrined. It's just like, some of these scripts that you would read about in other religions that's really similar to how the discourse are formed in Chanoyu. Like all of these myths, these legends, these famous names, this wonderful accomplishment or incontinent of these big names in the history, and how that kind of crystallized into this wonderful culture that we should treat it as a single truth, and we should protect it, and we should follow it, and we are doing so to kind of protecting a greater good or protecting the community, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about Chanayu that is fantastic and amazing. We could go on for hours about the merits of the Iamoto system, and if you look at it
Uh,
through the lens of an institution, it's the way it's been able to preserve itself and mold over time between Edo to Meiji to present day. Like there's some very interesting lessons to be learned about the concept of the survival of an institution into modernity.
yeah,
um,
it's how the Catholic Church survived the thousands of years.
it's being adaptive and being really actually quite savvy. And then you can put on the business lenses for Chanayu, and people don't like to think this. And some great tea scholars, like the author of Making Tea, Making Japan, and Dr. Rebecca Corbett, have talked about the concept of these tea ceremony schools as businesses. They are businesses. They need revenue. They have profits. And I'd
Mm,
love to look at the P&L. Some of them would be very interesting. But they are also businesses,
yeah,
as well as institutions, as well as bearers and holders of culture. Uh,
thou shalt donate 1/10 of your income.
your,
Uh,
your Catholic school education is paying off. This one is well indoctrinated.
but it is like the teachers are kind of like the priests. The Iamotos are like the archbishops, or the pope. Like there are a lot of similarities between the practices of the tea ceremony schools and how modern religions are formed.
The other interesting thing is I think Shanayu tends to attract a practitioner base that is a little more of a quiet type, someone less likely to ruffle feathers. And I think it tends to eject people that don't like these systematic authoritative systems
Mm.
because there's a lot of decision making that goes on behind the scenes that is entirely blind to the member, the student, the practitioner. And if you decided to ruffle a lot of feathers, imagine doing the same thing in a large company. Like you're just not going to get very far. And you probably aren't going to know that you're not going to get very far because you're not present or privy to those conversations that are happening in the back. If you write a big expose about systematic sexism in Midori-kai, in the Urasenke residency program, you're probably not getting your chame or your tea name, the license to teach. So, like,
That's
there's
not
a
the place to talk about that.
no. So, like, there's again, from a systematic institutional preservation perspective, if you're able to attract a lot of docile, more submissive um, group of practitioners, it makes change agents very hard. And
Mm,
we
yeah.
have only met one tea practitioner that studies in the Sansanke, and I'll keep this a little vague, that seems to be very rebellious. We asked them, like, how do you get away with this, basically? And they said, I just play my Gaijin card. So there is some
Uh,
ability to peek through the system and
but
to
the person is not Japanese, right?
yeah, non-Japanese. That's
Yeah.
true. So
It's very hard to break in from inside of the system. It's
yeah.
so intertwined with their own identity almost.
Yeah,
Um,
and so untouchable for so many reasons. Such a
so
fascinating topic, but it's one that, to be honest, we're not 100% sure that we get right. And we're not 100% sure if we're being too critical or not. We're expressing our personal beliefs with the context that we have, and we hope on this long form format are able to express them and justify them instead of just slandering. I think the critique of slandering is a little too harsh when we are justifying where our positions are coming from.
mm,
And it is not what we care about. The preservation of Chanoyu is actually very low on my list of things I care much more about the farmers. I care much more about innovation. I care much more about the people consuming the tea. I care much more about it living and thriving as a specialty product. On my stack rank of priorities, it is actually fairly low. I'm not Japanese. I have no vested interest in maintaining
you can
a
never be a Yamoto.
I could never be an Iamoto. No one can be because it's birthright almost or through marriage. I have no vested interest to care, essentially, compared to some of these other things. It's something that I've studied enough that I think I can fairly criticize it. But also, there's a lot that I don't know. And I'm certainly very open to my mind being changed in the future from people that have context that I'm missing. But it ultimately comes down to what you care about. And
Yeah.
exploring these tensions is what we love doing on the podcast. But I think these are the top two. Like the over industrialization argument is one thing that we're not sure if we have right. Our opinions have been a little more flexible as we explore this tension between tradition and innovation. And same thing with actually tradition and innovation within the consumption, meaning Chanayu versus sort of the modern cafe consumer,
Um,
which is driving the whole matcha industry.
yes, indeed. And I think that we just naturally care about, so to speak, we can only care about things that we have capabilities or agencies to explore and to
Mm.
learn more. And I think our opinion about the more modern days production of Japanese tea really, really fundamentally changed after we tried to produce it on ourselves.
Yes.
Which comes down to our little experiment that we done in a place called Ximen in China.
So we promised to talk about this on a previous podcast, but we can call ourselves matcha farmers, tencha farmers
Tantra
now,
makers,
tencha makers and matcha millers too.
not
Um,
good tantra make, but yeah, not yet.
so we had the opportunity to experiment with some shaded cultivation in China in a place called Ximen in Anhui. It's an area famous primarily for black tea. It's famously the original base of Earl Grey actually comes from Ximen Hongcha or Ximen black tea. It has a very old romanization in Chinese. It's actually Kimun.
Kimun, the Wade Guild romanization. So it's usually a symbol of something that exists for a long time. So yeah, it's a fascinating place, and we just happen to have some connection of a few local farmers out there that we had the opportunity to commission for a very little experiment.
So deep in a little tiny valley near some wild growing bamboo forests, we had, I don't know, it was a tiny plot. It ended up producing about 5 kgs of tencha, so probably, 25 to 30 kgs of wet leaf
Mm, mm.
were picked. And we had with the same bamboo that came from the bamboo forest next door. Our wonderful farmer collaborator hand built, raised tana shelf from the bamboo, and it was shaded.
Kanleisha shade.
Kanleisha shaded for about 3 weeks, and it was all seed propagated tea,
Mm,
primarily used for black tea, so it was very high
mm,
catechin content.
organic.
Probably why it didn't taste very good, and organic, and it
No.
was shaded for 3 weeks, and it was all handpicked. And then we processed it in his backyard
On a big wok that's filled with boiling water
and
and we
wood.
and wood.
It was a wood-fired wok. We put some water and essentially a gigantic steaming basket on top.
Yeah,
So actually, it's much more similar probably to the way that tencha was processed before any
back in the days.
industrialization.
Hmm.
Very hand processed. We did a bunch of experiments to figure what the right steaming time and duration was, which is a little painful. It was very much the art of steaming it, because even the amount of steam was controlled by how much wood we put in it. So even like having a constant heat source produce a constant amount of steam, and like if the steam was running low, we had to steam a little longer to make sure there was no reddening. There's a lot of skill involved, and
Yeah,
even the level of steaming was a very difficult art to kind of get right, which I think we
yeah.
got better as the afternoon progressed.
But I think what was really constraining us was the equipment. So one piece of equipment that really drag us down is the roaster. So the roaster that they use to roast black tea or hongcha in Ximen is just not powerful enough to roast tencha.
Like for a real proper tencha oven temperatures.
Yeah, yeah. The temperature and also to get the remaining of the water out quickly. So a lot of the tencha, some of the experimental batch, quote unquote, in the beginning, kind of just end up getting a second steam in the roaster
Yeah.
because it didn't vent out the steam or the water quickly enough.
And it degraded the color pretty significantly. Our
Yeah,
tencha looks very
yellow.
brown, green, yellow. Taste the way you would expect to. But going through the motions and doing this ourselves, even with the picking, like because we were essentially using a Zyrai field, it was a little difficult to coordinate things. We were there for a relatively short window, so we couldn't like go in every day like you hear
Mm,
about people having to do with Zyrai. So some were definitely a little past peak, and you could tell because the young leaves were a little bit more too mature, and some of the leaves were less mature. And this is just comes from the natural genetic diversity. Level of difference in the leaves were crazy to me, seeing that in a Zyrai
mm.
field that was ready to be picked. The glossiness, the sheen, the shine, the shape,
Even the
how
shape, yeah, the shape.
how serrated the edges of the leaves were, the shape of the leaves in the 3D. Like some are more curled and some are more flat than others. The color, some were more green or more lighter color, the number of buds, all sorts of things. It was crazy the
Yeah.
level of genetic diversity that a real Zyrai field has. And it gave me a whole new appreciation for how difficult it must have been before cultivars. Like really every single tree was very different.
Or the tea just must not have been
Very
tasted so.
good. Supposedly part of the chassis or the blender's job back in the day was to identify what needed to be picked when, and that must have been tricky.
Yeah.
Like, you
Well,
really have to have a new level of intimacy with your garden on a per plant basis. The cultivars, there's a lot of farmers right now during harvest season will show, okay, this half is Goko, this half is Okumidori or something. And you can see how they're ready at different times.
uh,
Imagine that being like a pointillism painting.
there's a pretty interesting kind of farming practice that I saw in Yunnan because all of the teas in Yunnan are wild teas in the tea forest. They would tie this little string with different colors to different tea in the forest to signify what teas are naturally early flushes to kind of help to guide the tea pickers to pick tea. So, today is the yellow day. Today is the blue day. Pretty interesting farming practices that you see. There's like all these variations that people to overcome natural difficulties.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was quite an experience.
So we hired 5 tea pickers. It took 5 tea pickers all day to pick all the material, and, we participated in the first round, but then we needed to go back for processing, and, that was interesting too, seeing how the local labor was organized and the skill of all of our tea processing, coworkers for the day, and they picked up on, like, the picking method pretty fast.
Yeah, yeah.
They were pros. They were so much better than our ability. So watching them work and even interact with each other, really just so chill. There's the chit-chatting and, picking and laughing and making
Mhm.
fun of us for our bad skill and slow speed. Um,
Yeah, that was quite fun.
and also seeing bugs too, very important. Is
Mm.
Japan, at least the last time we went hand picking, we didn't see a single bug. I think we saw
One
one
ladybug.
ladybug slowly dying, taking its last breath for pesticides as it fell over on its back.
Yeah.
I'm joking, but maybe not. But there are lots of bugs in this garden, which honestly, I can understand why some pesticides are being used because some of the tea leaves were definitely partially eaten with their
Yeah.
very rich amino acid content from the shading.
Yeah.
So it also made me appreciate that part.
The only kind of anti-insect, measures that they took was to put on this little, like, panels that they, kind of emit a kind of hormone that will attract bugs, and then it's a sticky panel, so
Yeah,
then
it's like those sticky fly traps.
yeah, but
So,
that was
somewhat.
definitely not enough for that, styrite plot that we
Actually,
farmed.
these, sticky traps are pretty clever. They glow, so they sit all day in the sun, absorb sunlight, and then they fluoresce at night,
Yeah, they
which,
glow at night.
attracts a lot of the night insects too. Pretty
Mhm.
clever method, actually. I wonder how effective it actually is, but very
Probably
cool.
not enough based on the, damage of some of the tea leaves.
So we definitely understood a new appreciation for pesticides too. Not that we're pro pesticide, but wow, we really understand why it can be necessary for shaded cultivation with these very
Mm,
amino acid umami rich leaves that
mm.
probably taste quite delicious to the bugs. So yeah, steaming, processing, shiage, that
Yeah.
was hard. Oh my goodness. There's a new appreciation for the destemming and deveining process, and lots of learning. We ended up using an old rice husker, so it's a mass-based wind separator. And we,
Totally manual.
yeah, we were, yeah, you had to hand turn it with a crank. I mean, it's literally hundreds of year old technology. You can see old versions of this both in China and Japan. If you go to the Kanbayashi Museum, they have a very similar wind braced hand crank separator. We were mechanically using the same thing that Uji matcha farmers were using back in the day. For the destemming and deveining. Wow, it leads to a lot of waste material.
Yeah.
It was very, I mean, no wonder, like, back in the days, you had to do some hand sorting of tencha with chopsticks. It gets part of the job done, but when we were milling that material, it required a lot of hand sorting. And then we learned all sorts of just, like, little interesting micro lessons, like, just how dry tencha is. Like, if you put your hand in a bag of tencha and are scooping it around or trying to pick out stems or foreign material, your hands will get super dry very quickly.
Just how quickly it got re-moisturized. It's like a sponge. It absorbs water so quickly,
Yeah.
especially in the, weather of Chimen. It's, quite difficult.
Altogether, it was a very interesting experiment that we could have never actually done in Japan, especially at that cost. Amongst the 5 tea pickers, all the tea processing equipment, the cost of putting that kanlei up, and the cost of the tea that was underneath it for that one harvest season, and they housed and fed us. And it
Mm.
was $500 for the whole week, including the material. Just the cost and, like, how welcome we felt, and we really were able to try to do whatever we wanted.
Well,
Like,
definitely got a, friendship quote from uncle, but, yeah, it's, I think it's also just a, kind of interesting project for them to, kind of experiment too.
yeah,
Because
then
this is clearly something that they have never seen before. And uncle at the tea farmer that we work with was just like very naturally curious about, all of these practices.
yeah, and he asked tons of great, like, follow-up questions, and he went in not from the position, I mean, he's had decades of tea processing knowledge, but he
Yeah.
really came in with a very open mind. and
Yeah.
asking us questions from like first principles.
Yeah, and he's just so talented. Like we kind of explain how the whole Tana structure needs to be and show him like maybe 3 photos. And he end up building this Tana structure that like got admired by some, Japanese farmers we talked to in Japan.
And show them
Like,
pictures.
where is this Tana? Like, this is very nicely built.
So
It's
it's amazing what can happen when cultures are mixed and you
yeah.
can truly learn from one another. So we actually see China as being quite fertile soil for, I don't know, a mocha renaissance, or even for, Japanese cultivars with Japanese processing methodologies for what could be considered mocha or matcha like product. So it leaves us very excited. And then, that's another thing that I think we may or may not get wrong is this whole matcha debate and defining what even is matcha and exploring that tension and the levels of disagreement we see in the industry about what actually should be defined as this thing. In country of origin, there's the ISO definition, there's
Mm,
various trademarks involving different like Uji matcha or Nishio matcha, and the way that all of these things get defined. It's just such an interesting story.
yeah.
And I hope we don't like beat the horse too hard on like all of this stuff, because it's literally like kind of how we've been mining ideas for over 100 different episodes. And that just goes to show just how interesting matcha. If you ask, like, why are we doing this? Why are we interested in tea? Why are we interested in matcha? It's all of this tension is where the real culture lies. The
Mm,
culture isn't this beautiful ceremony of tea ceremony. It's in this messiness,
yeah.
this humanness. So
It's
interesting.
in the people. So there will be no culture if there's no people.
Yes.
It's really the anthropological aspect of tea. It's so fascinating.
Yeah.
And no, and it's the part that we can be so relatable because we are humans too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to understand what other people are projecting onto this thing, how they've incorporated it into their lives.
Mm,
It's such an interesting story to try to be a student of,
yeah, yeah.
to learn more about.
It's fascinating. It's essentially a culture that two very unique, differently species co-built. It's Camellia sinensis and Homo sapien.
Absolutely, absolutely. And even amongst the tea community, one of the things that has really enriched our experience as we do this is having curiosity and wanting to learn more about other types of tea.
Mm,
So after 100 episodes, we were doing some reflecting about, I don't know, what makes us qualified to have a unique perspective to even want to become matcha educators or to concentrate this knowledge in a podcast. What makes us qualified? What makes our voice unique? And there's something that David from Tazumi said on our episode that we recorded with him that really resonated with me, and I think about it all the time. Is that tea ceremony practitioners could enrich their experience so much more if they took interest in the agriculture and the way that tea gets produced and what the farmers are doing and the cultivars, which really lives outside of the scope of learning Chanayu. And he also said that, all the people who are just interested in tea and in matcha, if they took a little more interest and a little more curiosity in learning about Chanayu, they could enrich their experience so much.
mm.
And this isn't just true within, matcha or Japanese tea ceremony. It's true across all types of tea. And some of the most interesting, open minded people that we've learned from in the Japanese tea world take interest
Mm,
in other types of tea.
right.
Like in Baisa Nakamura, like they really understand about oolong tea. If you go to Thailand and a lot of the Thai tea practitioners, and matcha practitioners, which is sort of like the concentration to some of the most advanced contemporary matcha culture, they take great interest in Taiwanese high mountain oolong and Ui Shan oolong, Yancha, cliff tea. They take great interest in pu'er. People know other cultivars like
Yeah.
Jinshuan. It's so much more interesting if you already have a knowledge about, let's say, like different Taiwanese high mountain tea cultivars, Jinchuan, Qinshin, Sujichun, Cuiyu, all of these different cultivars. And you're like, wow, cool. Jinshuan is being grown for tencha production in Chiang Rai in north of Thailand. Talk about a mix of cultures
Yeah.
that would just be lost on you if you weren't aware of the way that the Taiwanese were breeding tea in the 1980s, trying to come up with new flavors and invented the Qinshan cultivar or the
精选，
Jinchuan cultivar. And having tasted many different examples from Alishan or Shanlenqi or low elevation examples in the expression of that cultivar, there's so much that we can learn and explore across the entire tea world.
It's way too much. It's so energizing in a way that you just know there are so many unknowns to be explored. You have the context and like in some ways capability to participate in this mixing. I think that's something that has been getting me going to explore more and try more and stay curious and stay passionate about this course that you and I have been both undertaking for more than a decade
Yeah,
for now.
trying to learn about other types of tea. We were considering thinking about the French word ouvres, the American pronunciation, which means body of work. I've been thinking about that for a while, and I was floating it by Sam a few times whether or not we should end the Specialty Matcha podcast after 100 episodes. Have
Mm.
we already said enough? Is this enough? When do we call it quits? Is this the moment where we've said what we wanted to say, we've explored what we wanted to explore, and that we don't want to drag this on like Toy Story 7 or like
Or
all of these
just
franchises.
just another episode of Doctor Strange
Yeah.
or Doctor Who.
So we've given some serious consideration and we've decided that we are going to keep it going. There's enough new culture creation that I think that is left to be explored. And we would be ending it right on the eve of our matcha mill coming into the universe, where we're hoping will have some impact. And we're going to have a bias because we're going to be much closer to people using it. And our perception of you know people getting involved in the craft of making matcha is going to be very biased based on the people we're interacting with, but it is something that we wanted to document.
Mm.
This is not the end. We are going to continue.
There will be a season 5.
And we're probably going to start looping in more tea parallels a little more aggressively than we have in the past, particularly because that's where our interest lies. And that's what keeps us intellectually curious and personally motivated, is a much larger picture than just trying to preserve Japanese tea or even just matcha focused. We're going to keep calling it the Specialty Matcha Podcast, but we think that there's so much enrichment that can be done where you can really broaden the scope into broader tea culture.
Absolutely. I mean, like we are essentially evolving with the contemporary matcha movement. There will be other teas being milled into powder form, and there will be people enjoying these new forms of, whether or not you call them matcha or mocha or powder, whatever tea. Or even some new names in the future that we just don't know. They're all essentially coming from this very plan that we have been enjoying for thousands of years across all different cultures. It has been always a very internationalized product since the very beginning. And it will remain as a bridge to connect all cultures into the future.
There is so much too that we have left to learn. This is the other reason why we're not stopping it. Almost selfishly, I would love to know the origins of all these tea competitions in Japan. I would love to know how shaded cultivation actually spread in early Japanese tea history. I would love to know, people in Korea talk about people making Song Dynasty mocha in Korea. Where did that tradition go? And now you even see this Korean malcha ceremony. Like, that's super interesting. How did that survive? Did it not survive? Is it an artifact of the Japanese occupation in Korea? There's just so many questions about genetic diversity in Zairai, all of these new research centers and what they're researching, why they're researching it, where they're getting their money from. It's like following the money, following the culture, trying to understand the history, piece together all this stuff. I feel like we're also barely scratching the surface. It's so many curiosity gaps that I still have that are going to be a little more work to dig into. Because I feel like the lowest hanging fruit was picked from the first 100 episodes. So it's going to be a lot more homework for us. And we're also starting a secret project, which we will announce soon, that may or may not lead to another podcast. This will forever be our baby, our first podcast, but we also want to explore other types of tea. And actually, just by the nature of what we're doing, trying to meet matcha producers everywhere, meet tea people everywhere.
Mm,
We encounter a lot of very interesting people
yeah,
and interesting types of tea that we just can't talk about here.
and over the past, decades, we just have accumulated all these contacts in different regions and areas that we feel like there is a missing bridge that connects all of these contacts and people all together. And maybe like we can explore the opportunity to become the bridge at some point. Or if that's too ambitious, we want to see the opportunity of some of these cultures of learning can be commingled in a context that will just going to produce delicious or interesting product that people can enjoy.
Yeah,
Not just words, but also, taste.
100%. And this cultural mixing that can happen and all of the unthinkable opportunity that
Yeah.
happens
Yeah.
with this type of cultural exchange and dialogue. And
Yeah.
we can all enrich our experience so much if we learn from each other.
Exactly. I think that's something that's really unique about tea is that it's not just words that you can read from a book or videos that you can watch from a screen. It's actual thing that you can ingest into your body and you can experience it with other sense of your biological capability. Like you can feel so much more beyond just reading or watching something. And I think that's so interesting about tea or almost addictive about tea is that it really has the capability of teleporting you to somewhere else. And I think that's why it's such a interesting and influential foundation of a lot of these cultures and a lot of these cultural exchanges.
And
Mm.
it's a way of tapping into something larger than yourself, a history, a legacy, a shared experience. And you never stop being a student because there's just so much to learn
Yeah,
and these really interesting pockets of knowledge and experience and the human experience. Really, it's a fantastic beverage, and it's we're very excited as because it feels like the early innings of this early spread of tea and tea culture, internationally speaking. So those are things that we selfishly want to learn more about and to make some connections across the industry and to really enrich our own experience learning from all of
I
this.
think this curiosity is what really motivating us forward in doing a lot of things. Like right, this podcast, this machine, all of these experiment, drinking more tea.
And
Just
all of the
curious,
people that we've
love
met
it.
along the way, we've
Uh,
met so many like-minded people, and it's we're excited to have them on as guests perspectives and see what we can get tea and tea culture to look like moving forward.
yeah,
So we're very excited, and we get a lot wrong over time, and maybe some of our opinions don't age well. And we would all love to turn this into a dialogue too. If we'd love to know how do you feel about the progression of tea culture? How has your experience in tea been enriched by learning about other tea cultures? What has your matcha journey looked like? And we'd love to hear from all of our listeners.
yeah. Or your tea journey.
How your tea journey? Yeah, we'd
Yeah.
love to have you on. So anyway, thank you so much for your listenership. Anyway, thanks everyone for 100 episodes. We never thought we would get here. Um, and we're very excited to launch season 5. And we will be starting with our series on Uji, which I feel like is the grand accumulation of 100 episodes of curiosity and research. And we're very proud of the series. The first episode is going to be very unique. It's actually going to be a monologue of the long form research article. It's going to be read audiobook style. And then we're going to have a couple follow up episodes that are going to be editorial style, where we're going to pick a subsection or a topic of it and go deep dive even further together between Sam and I. And we're going to try to source some other opinions as well, sending this article around to some friends and bring in some diverse perspective at really understanding the modern origins of what we all consider matcha, which has its roots in Uji, the true origin story of modern shaded cultivation matcha, of what we've all known to grow and love, which is such an interesting story that we're very excited to unpack with everyone.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it, Ryan.
Yeah, it'll be great.
Yeah.
We're so stay tuned for season 5. Thank you so much. If you've made it this far and you haven't subscribed, please do subscribe. The numbers really help for discovery that help this podcast keep running. And thank you so much. Take care.
See you in the next season.
Bye.